Welcome back, guys. We're back to talk about American expansion, part two. And I'm Dr. Chris Erskine, and we're going to jump right into this American empire. In the last lesson, we talked about Teddy Roosevelt and the Spanish-American War. And I want you to look at this first slide. Now, on this first slide, we have 1898, the Treaty of Paris, the stunning debut of the U.S. as not just a world power, but a global empire with unstoppable military power. Now, this Treaty of Paris, this is what ends the Spanish-American War. And this is the moment that the United States really becomes a global power. And it's under McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt. If we look at the next slide, it also says American expansion. Continued prosperity, growth, expansion, power. This requires markets. It requires colonies. Now, the United States doesn't acquire colonies, not in the way that England does, or Spain, or France, or Germany. We acquired them a little bit differently, but it's the same idea. So we get new territories. Now look at the dates on the acquisitions of these new territories. Alaska in 1867, we got from Russia. We get the Philippines from Spain in 1898. Guam from Spain in 1898, Hawaii from itself in 1898, Puerto Rico from Spain in 1898, Cuba from Spain in 1898, and Samoa we take over from itself in 1899. So all of these new territories, now Hawaii we know becomes a state, Puerto Rico and Guam are protectorates. The United States lets go of Philippines after 30 or 40 years. And Alaska is a state. Samoa is also an American protectorate. Cuba, of course, is its own country today, but there's a little corner of Cuba that we'll see a map in just a minute that is an American military base. And on the next slide, we see in 1902, just a few years after we got Cuba, we withdraw from Cuba, except for Guantanamo Bay. Now on the next slide, you see a map of Cuba. And if you look on the right side of Cuba on the bottom, you'll see a little spot that is where America is, and it says Guantanamo Bay. And the only thing there today is a U.S. Marine base. Otherwise, Cuba belongs all to Cuba. And Cuba, of course, wants Guantanamo Bay back, but the United States government does not want to give Guantanamo Bay back to Cuba. On the next slide, we see some kind of the Filipino struggle. The United States fought off and on with the Filipinos until 1946, until a year after World War II. And during this time, perhaps 220,000 Filipinos died in the struggle for independence. It was kind of, why don't Americans at this point understand that we got our independence 160 or 70 or 130 or 40 years before this, after we acquired the Philippines from Spain, and about 4,000 Americans died. This is from the beginning in 1899. It's a very controversial war. Some Americans believe that we shouldn't be trying to have this war. Andrew Carnegie says, a note to a friend, and we can read this in McKinley's cabinet, is one of McKinley's advisors. Andrew Carnegie was a very rich person. We talked about him in a previous chapter. He writes this: "You seem to have finished your work of civilizing the Filipinos. It is thought that about 8,000 of them have been completely civilized and sent to heaven," meaning they were killed. "I hope you like it." And some people, including Carnegie, tried to buy the Philippines from the United States and then to let them have their own independence. The United States was not ready to let them have their own independence. The Philippines was a colony, the idea of a colony, where we could have military in this place and it would help protect ourselves from places like Japan. On the next slide, we can see where the Philippines are. You probably know where the Philippines are if you were to look at the map, and you've got China right there in the middle with Asia, and the red arrow pointing to the Philippines. Guam, Samoa, Puerto Rico, these are all still American territories. They're not states. People born in these countries have U.S. passports, they're U.S. citizens, but they don't pay U.S. federal income taxes, and they cannot vote in American elections. Hawaii becomes the 50th state of the United States in 1959. And if you look at the next slide, we see a map of U.S. imperialism from 1867, starting with Alaska, until 1906. You can see these territories all across the world where the United States acquires new territories. So the United States was a colonial power. We just joined the colonial power game about 30 or 40 years too late. The European powers were getting into developing colonies after in the 1860s. And they really kept those colonies. Well, as you know from Hong Kong and Macau, they kept them until the 1990s. And most colonies today are gone. But the legacy is still there. Certainly in Hong Kong, a lot of people speak English. In Macau, a lot of people speak Portuguese. In South America, most people speak either Spanish or Portuguese. And in parts of Africa, the first language in parts of Africa is English in some places and French in some places. And so the legacy or the impact of these colonies is still there in these colonies around the world. Southeast Asia was French, colonized by the French for quite a long time. On the next slide, we see these open door notes, and there was a Secretary of State by the name of John Hay. And in 1899, the open door notes forced China and European powers in China to open the ports of entry. So open Dalian, open Shanghai, open Xiamen, open Guangzhou, these European powers to let go of trade policies so that the United States can trade also. And these European powers, they wanted a monopoly. They wanted to control who traded with China in those ports. And so the United States, under Secretary of State John Hay, now the Secretary of State is an advisor to the President, and he deals with international relations. And the Secretary of State developed what we now call the open door notes, meaning that everyone should be able to trade freely. In 1900, and this is an event that you are very familiar with, I'm sure, there was what's called the Boxer Uprising against foreigners and Christianity, and this is in China. And President McKinley sent 50,000 troops to Beijing to put down this uprising. Now, Americans today will ask, well, why is an American president sending American troops to China to put down an internal Chinese dispute? If we had a dispute here in the United States, would China send their army to put down a rebellion in the United States? Not ever. I don't ever think that would happen. And Mark Twain, who was an American author, was on the side of China. He was against what the United States did. And he says this: we Americans, we do not allow Chinamen to come here. And I say in all seriousness that it would be a graceful thing to let China decide who shall go there. If they don't want Christian missionaries in China, they should be able to say no. So the next slide, we have what's called the Roosevelt Corollary. And this is a corollary is something that we add to an extra something. And it is an extra something to the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine was an idea that came out in the 1820s, 1823, with President Monroe, in which he said that in South America, South Americans should stay out of the business, European power should stay out of the business of going into South America or in North America, because we would take that to be a threat to our own security. And so President Roosevelt, almost 100 years later, 75, 80 years later, adds this to it. He says this: the United States reserves the right to intervene in the internal affairs of Latin American nations to ensure order and keep the European powers out. And so this is the beginning of the United States as the world policeman. Now, Americans today understand the notion of American policemen, that a lot of American officials and a lot of Americans believe that if there is a war somewhere, the United States should go and help put that war down. But not all Americans believe that. So the Roosevelt Corollary also put forward and kind of undertook other projects. And one of them, the big one, was the Panama Canal. And the Panama Canal, we can see in 1903, when they begin building it, is under TR, or Teddy Roosevelt. And the French had tried to build a canal in the region of Panama for decades, but they were not successful. And so they abandoned the effort, and Teddy Roosevelt came in there, and he believed that this was a worthwhile thing to do because we can connect the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean just by building a canal, digging a trench that boats can sail through across the region of Panama. Now, at the time, Panama was part of the country of Colombia, but Colombia wanted to charge the United States too much money to use the canal, to dig the canal, and the United States didn't want to pay that much money. And so they encouraged a group of rebels to overthrow the government of Colombia in the region of Panama. And when they did, when the rebels overthrew their government, the United States recognized this new region as a country, the country of Panama. And so Teddy Roosevelt, supported this rebel movement. The next president, President Taft, did what we call dollar diplomacy today. We called it then as well. China does dollar diplomacy. Taiwan, the province of China that wants to believe that they're independent, does dollar diplomacy. And a lot of countries exercise dollar diplomacy. We had a foreign company called the United Fruit Company in Honduras, and today it's called Chiquita Bananas, and it's still a company today. And the United Fruit Company was in Honduras and in Costa Rica, and they were under threat of being taken over. And so what do? Well, we put enough money into the local governments to make sure that American interests are protected. And so essentially the countries cannot act as though they, freely, if there's so much money corrupting what the government wants to do in its own best interests. And so Nicaragua had planned to build their own canal. Nicaragua was a country right next to Panama. They wanted to build their own canal, but Taft sent troops in, the army in, to overthrow the government in 1910. And so the United States did not want competition with the Panama Canal that they had built. And going to the next slide, American expansion. We have two columns here. One is before 1898 and one is after 1898. And what you see here is kind of this idea that America before 1898 is small, inward-looking, not a strong military, and has ideas that we want to expand and become an empire. Before 1898, we don't have that. After 1898, we do. And look at the very bottom one, because this is where we become, after 1898, is where we become the world's policeman, or where we think we become the world's policeman. Before 1898, it's Europe. After 1898, it becomes the United States. And Teddy Roosevelt is responsible for a lot of that, as is William McKinley, who was president before Teddy Roosevelt, and Taft, President Taft, who's president after Roosevelt. So from about 1896 until about 1912, we have this development of a strong federal government, outward-looking ideas, international relations are growing. It's a major change in the American posture or attitude in the world. And the role of the United States in the world changes after 1898. All right, we'll talk to you guys next time in the next chapter. Until then, have a good afternoon. Have a good evening.